Tonight's speaker, Maurizio Giammarco, has been here before, as you know, 2 weeks ago, and so we're asking him back. He's from the English department at Temple University, and he is going to be talking about Stanley Kubrick. And you know, from Kubrick, like any other great director or screenwriter, you remember lines, isn't that so? And I think of all the films I've seen by him and famous characters. One of my favorites, of course, is Dr. Strangelove, and well, countless. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Maurizio Giammarco back to Camden County College.
Thank you, Jack, for that gracious welcome, and thank you, everyone, for your warm welcome as well. And again, I appreciate you coming out on this cold and windy night. I'd like to share a few thoughts with you on Stanley Kubrick, and what I'm going to do this evening is the following. I was here a couple of weeks ago, as Jack mentioned, and I talked about the films of the 1950s, the more notable films that he had made during that period: Killer's Kiss, The Killing, Paths of Glory, and then Lolita. But tonight, I'm going to focus primarily on the second half of his career, though I am going to show you a couple of clips from Paths of Glory to just give you an overview in terms of Kubrick's cinema. So along those lines, everyone, what I'd like to do now is to give you a very brief context in terms of Kubrick's background, and then I'll turn to the first of 5 clips tonight. I'm hoping that, time permitting, we'll be able to look at Paths of Glory, look at A Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, Full Metal Jacket, and then end with Eyes Wide Shut, which was Stanley Kubrick's last film in 1999. So along those lines, everyone, if I may, let me begin by just offering a few opening comments on Kubrick, and that clearly he is considered one of the most important filmmakers in world history. And there have been a number of directors, especially from the new Hollywood of the 1970s onward, who have been profoundly influenced by him. Such filmmakers as Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, James Cameron, Woody Allen, Terry Gilliam, the Coen brothers, and Ridley Scott. They have all cited Kubrick as influence. Steven Spielberg has said that, again, no one shoots a film better in history than Stanley Kubrick has. And he also says that the way he tells a story is antithetical to the way that normally we receive such stories in the cinema, which makes him very singular and unique in this regard. And Martin Scorsese has also mentioned that for most of his career, Kubrick's films did not receive unanimous praise. More often than not, they received mixed reviews at the time of their release. It is only later, after the films were seen again, that they were reassessed, reevaluated, and they were considered to be the brilliant films that they are. In fact, the only film that received unanimous critical praise is the one that we're going to be watching tonight, the first clip, and that is Paths of Glory. I'd like to just mention very quickly, too, some of the influences on Kubrick himself, that he was profoundly influenced by the Soviet filmmakers Sergei Eisenstein and Vyacheslav Pudovkin. And Pudovkin wrote a book called Film Technique about the importance of editing in film. And many critics have suggested that this is the single most important work in the development of Kubrick's private aesthetics in terms of his cinema. So clearly Pudovkin is a very important influence. Another important influence was Konstantin Stanislavski, the Russian director who worked very closely with the plays of Anton Chekhov and with Chekhov himself. And Kubrick studied his work in terms of directing. And then finally, another important influence is the writings of Sigmund Freud. This relationship between the superego and the id, something that I'll come back to repeatedly throughout my lecture. So clearly, Freud has a very profound influence on Kubrick. In terms of his younger life, he was a staff photographer for Look magazine. He started working at Look magazine at 17 years old, and by the time he finished working there, he had over 900 of his pictures, again, published in that magazine. And Look magazine was considered very much a cinematic magazine. And a number of critics have noted that Kubrick, when you look at his photographs, he had the ability to be able to stage his photographs in order to shape the reality. Now, of course, this idea of staging a shot, if you will, in order to shape reality as he sees it, becomes very instrumental in terms of what we see in his films themselves. So again, his background as a photographer is enormously important in terms of making the transition from photography to film. He also learns something else during this period, and that is chess, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. I also want to mention, too, everyone, that during the 1940s and especially during the 1950s, Stanley Kubrick is working in New York, and this is a period in which New York is particularly thriving in the way of modern art, in the way of various movements that are taking place. For example, you have the theater of the absurd, which is beginning to emerge and become quite notable during this period, and that will also have a very strong influence on Kubrick's career. Also, we have a number of foreign films that are coming to America as well. For example, we have the films of Jean Vigo, the French filmmaker, Carl Dreyer, and the Italian neorealists, and their view of reality. And of course, this idea of reality also plays an important role in Kubrick's early films. Less so later in his career, but certainly in the films of the 1950s and early 1960s. And then finally, another important influence is the New York School of Photographers, specifically Lee Friedlander, Robert Frank, and Diane Arbus, who again were very important to Kubrick, especially in adopting a very surrealistic approach to how they saw reality. And in fact, Diane Arbus is even quoted in The Shining in terms of one of the scenes, one of the shots that Kubrick sets up. So all these influences converge, if you will, to create the portrait of Kubrick as a filmmaker in the way that we see him through his films. And on that note, everyone, what I'd like to do now is this. I'd like to focus on key themes that we see over and over again in Kubrick's cinema. The first is this, and we're going to see these themes at work in all the film clips tonight. The impulsive, flawed, instinctive nature of humanity. We will certainly see that at work. We also are going to see the criticism of military values. Kubrick only made 13 films, and 6 of those films he dealt with military values. He explored them, analyzed them, and criticized them. Those films include Fear and Desire, Paths of Glory, Spartacus, Dr. Strangelove, Barry Lyndon, and Full Metal Jacket. Another important theme that we see in his films is the potential conflict between humanity's irrational, chaotic urges and the rational control evident in many areas of human endeavor. So, in other words, in his films, we see the best of mankind, but also the worst in constant juxtaposition, in constant conflict, in constant collision with each other. Then we also have the corruption of the individual by society, and we see that repeatedly in his films as well. And if you look at your packet for a moment, everyone, and you turn to page 4, there are other additional themes here. The relationship between the artificial and the natural, A Clockwork Orange, that is an encapsulation of that very idea. The relationship between the constrained and the unleashed, the relationship between the civilized and the base, and the relationship between man and the machine. And if you would, everyone, I'd like you to turn to page 5 for a moment. I just want to look at a couple of very brief excerpts, and then with that, turn to our first clip, which is Paths of Glory. And if you would please, if you go to page 5, towards the bottom of the page here, next to the last paragraph, but it's a mistake to say that Kubrick believed the id, in Freudian terms, would always triumph over the superego. He believed that both forces would always be with us and would always be locked in battle. That is Kubrick's ethos. The battle between constraints and freedoms never ends. On the one hand, society will always oppress. On the other hand, society is good because it keeps us from killing each other. And then over on the next page, on the one hand, our natures are evil because they are sexually depraved and murderous. On the other hand, our natures are good because they're creative and artistic. And then finally, this is a different ethos from other filmmakers. Many seem to take a side. Human nature is wicked and must be subdued, or culture is wicked and must be rebelled against. Humanity will ultimately triumph, or society will destroy humanity. Kubrick was neither a romantic nor an Orwellian. In one sense, he was a Freudian. Neither the id nor the superego are going anywhere. So this is something that we see repeatedly throughout his films. And on that note, everyone, what I'd like to do now is turn to our first film clip, which is Paths of Glory, and illustrates this criticism of military values that I've been speaking about a moment ago, along with some other themes as well. And if I may, if you go to page 21, Paths of Glory was made in 1957 and was based on the novel of the same name by Humphrey Cobb, and it's set during World War I. And the film stars Kirk Douglas as Colonel Dax, the commanding officer of French soldiers who refused to continue a suicidal attack Dax attempts to defend them against a charge of cowardice in court-martial. The title of the novel and the film comes from a line from the Thomas Gray poem of 1751, elegy written in a country churchyard. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. The novel is based on a true story of 5 French soldiers in World War I who were falsely accused of cowardice and shot by a firing squad. And what we're going to be seeing, everyone, is the opening of the film in which we have one general visiting another at this enormously expansive, lavish chateau in which he is attempting to give him this particular mission. And if he succeeds in this mission, then he will be promoted. And several techniques I'd like to share with you before we look at the clip. And one technique is the following, something that we will see repeatedly in Kubrick's cinema, and that is the one-point perspective, or as critics often call it, the tunnel or the corridor shot. And that is the idea that Kubrick likes to shoot a scene so that there is a horizon in the center of the frame, and everything is directed towards the center of that frame. It's very much like the vanishing point perspective in painting. So in this respect, he's very fond of using that idea, and along with that, he's also using a tracking shot. Now, a tracking shot simply means a camera is following a character when he or she is moving from one side to the other. But here, what he does is he uses a reverse tracking shot so that as the character is moving towards us, the camera is retreating. So he's combining both the one-point perspective and the reverse tracking shot to illustrate this idea that the character is on a journey, obviously a physical journey, but so often it can be an emotional journey, an intellectual journey, an exploratory journey, a spiritual journey, and here it's a militaristic one, and you'll see an example of that in a moment. The other technique that I also wanted to share with you, and I alluded to this a moment ago, was his preoccupation with chess. Now, Kubrick learned chess when he was a very young man, and chess informs all of his films. The idea that for Kubrick, and he mentions this, the 2 qualities that chess taught him were patience and discipline. And that is something that he brings to bear in all of his films in terms of the craftsmanship of his work. And he has often said that it's better to have patience and discipline, especially when you're entertaining 2 alternatives when an impulsive action might seem more attractive. And he said it's very dangerous for an artist simply to rely on intuition. So in this respect, everyone, he brings to bear the notion of patience and discipline. And you will see that in this film clip when the 2 military men are in this chateau. Look at the way that Kubrick films them. It's almost as if they're chess pieces on a board. How the one is attempting to coerce, seduce, manipulate the other into taking the mission. And something else I would like to add too as well, the chateau has these enormous paintings, lavish furnishings, once again showing the creativity of man, man's cultural achievement, but at the same time you have 2 military men discussing war and discussing the idea of death and violence. So again, we have this very powerful juxtaposition between man's creativity, but also man's penchant for destruction as well. So we're going to see 2 clips here, beginning with the conversation in the chateau, and then the moment when the general visits the troops in the trenches and he attempts to boost their morale, and you'll see the example of the one-point perspective and the tracking shot. So if we can, may we turn to the first clip. Okay.
War began between Germany and France on August 3rd, 1914. 5 weeks later, the German army had smashed its way to within 18 miles of Paris. There, the battered French miraculously rallied their forces at the Marne River, and in a series of unexpected counterattacks, drove the Germans back. The front was stabilized, and shortly afterwards developed into a continuous line of heavily fortified trenches, zigzagging their way 500 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss frontier. By 1916, after 2 grisly years of trench warfare, the battle lines had changed very little. Successful attacks were measured in hundreds of yards and paid for in lives by hundreds of thousands.
General Blas.
Hello, George. How are you?
Wonderful seeing you again. Really wonderful. Well, this is splendid. Superb.
Well, I've tried to create a pleasant atmosphere in which to work.
Well, you succeeded marvelously. I wish I had your taste in carpets. And pictures.
Yeah, much too kind, George. Much too kind. Sit down, George.
Thank you.
I really haven't done very much.
place is much the same as it was when I moved in.
Paul, I've come to see you about something big. It's top secret. It must go no further than your chief of staff and not to him, unless you can trust his discretion.
Of course.
A group of armies is forming on this front for an offensive very soon. Headquarters is determined to make a complete breakthrough. Why are you smiling?
I'm really sorry. I thought for just a moment I knew what you were going to say. Please go on.
I never knew you were a mind reader. What did you think I was about to say?
Something about the anthill.
You are a mind reader.
Well, it is a key position. It's in my sector. To be perfectly honest, I've heard some talk. You know, there's nothing really secret around headquarters.
Well, what do you think?
Well, it's the key to the whole German position in this sector. They've held on to it for a year now, and it looks as though they'll hold on to it for another year if they want to.
Paul, I have formal orders to take the anthill no later than the 10th, that's the day after tomorrow.
That comes pretty close to being ridiculous, don't you think?
I don't imagine I'd be here if I really thought that. Paul, if there's one man in this army who can do this for me, it's you.
It's out of the question, George. Absolutely out of the question. My division was cut to pieces. What's left of it is in no position even to hold the anthill, let alone take it. I'm sorry, but that's the truth.
Well, Paul, there was something else I wanted to tell you. However, I'm sure that you'll misunderstand my motives in mentioning it.
What was it?
No, you'll be bound to misunderstand. However, as your friend, maybe I should tell you.
What are you trying to say, George?
Paul, the talk around headquarters is that you are being considered for the 12th Corps.
The 12th Corps?
Yes, and with that another star. Now I've pushed it all I can. 12th Corps needs a fighting general, and you're overdue in that star. We both know that your record is good enough for you to refuse this assignment on the grounds you've stated. No one would question your opinion. They'd simply get someone else to do the job. So, you shouldn't let this influence your opinion, Paul.
Oh, I'm sorry. Have a cognac?
No, thanks, Paul. Not before dinner.
George, I'm responsible for the lives of 8,000 men. What is my ambition against that? What is my reputation in comparison to that? My men come first of all, George. And those men know it, too.
Yes, I know that they do.
You see, George, those men know that I would never let them down.
That goes without saying.
The life of one of those soldiers means more to me than all the stars and decorations and honors in France.
So, you think this attack is absolutely beyond the ability of your men at this time?
I didn't say that, George. Nothing is beyond those men once their fighting spirit is aroused.
Well, Paul, I don't want to push you into it if you think it's ill-advised.
Don't worry, George. You couldn't do that if you tried. Of course, artillery would make an enormous difference. What artillery support can you give me?
Well, I'll see.
What about replacements?
We'll see what we can do, but I feel sure that you can get along with what you have.
Might just do it.
Oh, Paul, I knew that I was right to come to you. You are the man to take the anthill. Now, as far as that star is concerned.
Yeah, nothing to do with my decision. If anything, it would sway me the other way.
I realize that perfectly, Paul.
Now, when do you say you'll see this coming off?
No later than the day after tomorrow.
We just might do it. Hello there, soldier. Ready to kill more Germans?
Yes, sir.
What's your name, soldier?
Sir, Private for Royal Company A.
Uh-huh. You married, Private? Well, I'll bet your mother's proud of you. Well, carry on, Private, and good luck to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Good morning. Hello there, soldier. Ready to kill more Germans?
Yes, sir.
Ha-ha. Working over your rifle, I see. Well, that's the way. It's a soldier's best friend. You be good to it, and it'll always be good to you.
Yes, sir.
Well, good luck to you, soldier. Carry on. Hello there, soldier. Ready to kill more Germans? That is, everything all right, soldier?
All right. Yes, sir, I'm all right.
Ha. Good fella. Are you married, soldier?
Married? Me married?
Yes. Have you got a wife?
A wife? Have I got a
Sir.
wife?
He's a bit shell-shocked. I beg your pardon, Sergeant. There is no such thing as shell-shock. Have you got a wife, soldier?
My wife? My wife? Yes, I have a wife. I'm never going to see her again. I'm going to be killed.
Get a grip on yourself. You're acting like a coward.
I am a coward, sir.
Snap out of it, soldier. Sergeant, I want you to arrange for the immediate transfer of this baby out of my regiment. I won't have other brave men contaminated by him. Yes, sir. Carry on, Sergeant.
You are right, sir. I start to think that Spratt isn't checked. You know, General, I'm convinced that these tours of yours have an incalculable effect upon the morale of these men. In fact, I think the fighting spirit of the 701st derives from it.
No, it was just born in them.
Thank you, Joe. Everyone, you can see here then, of course, the ironic commentary that's taking place on the part of Kubrick towards the military. Notice how the general, when he's walking through the trenches, we hear the percussion, we hear the drums. That becomes a very ironic, sardonic comment on his attempts to, quote, boost the morale of the soldiers. And notice, too, how he continually asks each soldier, are you ready to kill more Germans? In a sense, the question seems very robotic. It's as if he himself has been turned now into a machine. And this is something that Kubrick will come back to again and again in his films. Also, did you notice, too, the immense space of the chateau itself and how it seemed to overwhelm the characters themselves? And in Kubrick's films, over and over again, the idea of history, if you will, institutions, often will engulf and overwhelm the individual. And of course, we see that in Paths of Glory. On page 22, I wanted to share something else about Paths of Glory in contrast to the other films that have been made about World War I. In that opening paragraph on page 22 of the several major films about World War I, only Paths of Glory depicts the conflict in all its cruel, almost laughably absurd logic. Once again, we see the absurdist element already in this film. All Quiet on the Western Front, Grand Illusion, The Dawn Patrol, and Sergeant York are humanistic, romantic, or patriotic by comparison. And to underscore the power of the film, Winston Churchill once observed that Paths of Glory came closer than any other film to catching the mood of the Great War. I also want to mention, too, that with Paths of Glory and then with Lolita in 1962, this is the period that is essentially realistic in nature regarding Kubrick's cinema. We see elements of the absurd, we see elements of the surrealistic, if you will, in these films, but they are part of the texture, part of the fabric, if you will, of the realistic framework of the films. After Lolita, when we start moving into Dr. Strangelove, 2001, A Clockwork Orange, and so on, then we begin to see those elements, the absurd, the surrealistic, the fantastical, really come to the forefront in Kubrick's cinema. So in essence, then, Lolita in 1962 becomes a transitional film from the realistic period to a much more fantastical, absurdist, surrealistic period regarding Kubrick's cinema. And on that note, everyone, what I'd like to do now is turn to our next film clip, and we move now to 1971 and A Clockwork Orange. And everyone, if you would please, if you just go to page 31 in your packet, and this gives you a very brief summary of A Clockwork Orange. 1971 dystopian crime film, adapted, produced, and directed by Stanley Kubrick, based on Anthony Burgess's novel of the same name. Alex, the main character, is a charismatic, antisocial delinquent whose interests include classical music, especially Beethoven, and what is termed the ultraviolence. In fact, he is a very charismatic figure, and Kubrick has described him as a young Richard III in that respect. He leads a small gang of thugs whom he calls his droogs, and the film chronicles a horrific crime spree of his gang, capture, and rehabilitation via controversial conditioning. Alex narrates most of the film in Nadset, a fractured adolescent slang composed of Slavic, especially Russian, English, and Cockney rhyming slang. And here, everyone, I'd like to draw your attention now to two other aspects of Kubrick's cinema that we begin to see much more so. And the first is this, in the way of performance. In the films of the 1950s and early 1960s, the acting tends to be, quote, much more naturalistic, much more realistic in nature. But when we start moving into A Clockwork Orange and the films that follow that film, the performative aspects of these films becomes quite different. There are two aspects at work here. One is that many times the characters will speak in almost a banal way, in a very slow, deliberate, mannered fashion that suggests an absurdist quality about themselves and the relationship to each other. The other aspect is actors, the characters, will often perform in a very theatrical, over-the-top style. And why does Kubrick do this? Kubrick does this because he wants to avoid melodrama, and he wants to avoid any kind of sentiment or sentimentality. So in essence, what he's asking us to do is he's asking us to step back and not be so much engaged, immersed, if you will, in the characters themselves, to be sympathetic or empathetic, but rather to be more an observer, be more detached in terms of how he looks at human nature. Another aspect which is important, which we'll see in this opening clip in A Clockwork Orange, is the aesthetics of the grotesque. Now, the grotesque is a very important concept in literature and in art, and it dates back to the time of the Roman Empire. And there's a landmark study called The Grotesque in Literature and Art by Wolfgang Kaiser, and he identifies two forms of grotesque art. The first he describes as demonic, and he categorizes the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch in this manner, that they fall under the category of the demonic. The second category, much more satirical in nature, belongs to the category of Peter Bruegel, the elder, and the nature of his work is much more comic, much more satirical. So whether it be demonic or whether it be comic, the goal is the same for both forms, and that is to upend social norms. In other words, when we think of the world, we like to think of it in conventional terms. That is, we like to think of it as being orderly, stable, rational. But the idea of the grotesque is to undercut those ideas. And so the notion of the grotesque reveals a world to us that is irrational, that is chaotic, that is absurd, that is capricious, that is violence. So in that sense, this is the world as it should be seen, so to speak, according to the grotesque artists. And Kubrick very much is working within this tradition. And there's a very long history in international cinema regarding the grotesque. We have the films of Sergei Eisenstein, Luis Buñuel, Akira Kurosawa, Roman Polanski, and of course Federico Fellini. And then in terms of contemporary filmmakers, we have David Cronenberg, we have David Lynch, and then we have the Coen brothers, all working within this vein of the grotesque. Kubrick is working very much in this vein as well. And when we think of the grotesque in film, what do we see? We can see wide-angle close-ups. We have masks. We have makeup. We have the selection of actors who have distinctive physical attributes that, again, give us this idea of the grotesque. And all of this we're about to see in A Clockwork Orange. So with that, everyone, I'd like to show you then the opening of A Clockwork Orange. And with it, once again, we're going to see the example of the one-point perspective, the corridor shot, in terms of the camera retreating and giving us the world, if you will, of the near future in England and what has happened to this society. So if we may, can we turn to the first clip, please?
There was me, that is Alex, and my three droogs, that is Pete, Georgie, and Dim. And we sat in the Korova milk bar trying to make up our razoo-dogs what to do with the evening. The Korova milk bar sold Milk Plus Velocet, or Synthemesk, or Drencrum, which is what we were drinking. This would sharpen you up and make you ready for a bit of the old ultra-violence.
In Dublin
we can pause here. Thank you, Joe. Everyone, as you can see, very different from Paths of Glory, is it not, in terms of the mise en scène. And when I say mise en scène, everyone, that is a term that comes from French theater, and the mise en scène simply refers to the costume design, the set design, the composition, the lighting, the choice of actor, the choice of film stock, the overall image of the world that we see on screen, the mise en scène. So looking at that is dramatically different from what we've just seen in Paths of Glory. And with that, I also would like to add something else, too, regarding Kubrick's approach to the structure of his films. And you see this in The Clockwork Orange, and you also see it in subsequent films, that he often likes to construct his films very much like a three-act play. So we have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So obviously we're seeing the beginning here. We're introduced to Alex and his droogs, and then we are going to see the crime spree that they're about to embark on. The second act, if you will, which we're going to see a clip from in a moment, deals with his capture after he's been arrested for murder, and he is sent to prison, and he will undergo this experimental program, the Ludovico program, in which he will be, quote, rehabilitated. He will be cured of his violent impulses and then released back into society. And then in Act 3 of the film, we see Alex then released from prison. He's reassimilated back into society, and all of the victims, all the people that he had victimized in Act 1 now reappear in Act 3, and then we see how they respond to his character and the changes that have taken place within him. So here, everyone, is the second act, and this is a key moment. And if we may, can we turn to this clip, and then I'll offer a few other thoughts?
Wood. Where I was taken to, brothers, was like no cine I ever visited before. I was bound up in a straitjacket, and McGulliver was strapped to a headrest with like wires running away from it. Then they clamped like lid locks on my eyes so that I could not shut them, no matter how hard I tried. It seemed a bit crazy to me, but I let them get on with what they wanted to get on with. If I was to be a free young Malchik again in a fortnight's time, I would put up with much in the meantime, oh my brothers. So far, the first film was a very good professional piece of cine, like it was done in Hollywood. The sounds were real horror show. You could slooshy the screams and moans, very realistic. And you could even get the heavy breathing and panting of the tall-chopping Malchiks at the same time. And then what do you know? Soon our dear old friend, the red vino on tap, the same in all places like it's put out by the same big firm, began to flow. It was beautiful. It's funny how the colors of the real world only seem really real when you video them on a screen. Now, all the time I was watching this, I was beginning to get very aware of like not feeling all that well. And this I put down to all the rich food and vitamins. But I tried to forget this, concentrating on the next film, which jumped right away on a young Devotchka, who was being given the old in-out, in-out. First by one Malchik, then another, then another. When it came to the 6th or 7th Malchik, leering and smecking, and then going into it, I began to feel really sick. But I could not shut me glasses. And even if I tried to move my glass balls about, I still could not get out of the line of fire of this picture.
Get me up. I want to be sick. Get something for me to be sick in.
Very soon now, the drug will cause the subject to experience a death-like paralysis, together with deep feelings of terror and helplessness. One of our early test subjects described it as being like death, a sense of stifling or drowning. And it is during this period we have found that the subject will make his most rewarding associations
between his catastrophic experience of environment and the violence he sees.
Leaving classes!
Dr. Brodsky is pleased with you. You've made a very positive response. Now, tomorrow there will be 2 sessions, of course, morning and afternoon.
You mean I have to biddy 2 sessions in one day?
I imagine you'll be feeling a little bit limp by the end of the day, but we have to be hard on you. You have to be cured.
It was horrible.
Of course it was horrible. Violence is a very horrible thing. That's what you're learning now. Your body's learning it.
I just don't understand about feeling sick the way I did. I never used to feel sick before. I used to feel like the very opposite. I mean, doing it or watching it, I used to feel real horror show.
You felt ill this afternoon because you're getting better. You see, when we're healthy, we respond to the presence of the hateful with fear and nausea. You're becoming healthy, that's all. By this time tomorrow, you'll be healthier still.
It was the next day, brothers, and I had truly done my best morning and afternoon to play it their way and sit like a horror show cooperative malchick in the chair of torture while they flashed nasty bits of ultra-violence on the screen. Though not on the soundtrack, my brothers, the only sound being music. Then I noticed in all my pain and sickness what music it was that like cracked and boomed. It was Ludwig van. 9th Symphony, 4th movement.
About sin.
Using Ludwig van like that, he did no harm to anyone. Beethoven just wrote music.
Are you referring to the background score?
Yes!
You've heard Beethoven before?
Yes!
So you're keen on music?
Yes!
Can't be helped. Here's the punishment element, perhaps. The governor ought to be pleased.
Thank you, Joe. Note the irony here that we have Beethoven's Ninth juxtaposed against what? The atrocities of the Nazis. So we have the best of mankind, but also the worst as well. And also, it's interesting, too, one of the other questions that the film raises is, can culture redeem man? As Kubrick himself has said, that Hitler and many of the members of his circle, if you will, enjoyed music, appreciated Beethoven, enjoyed artistry, and yet it did nothing from preventing them of committing the atrocities that they did. So this is one of the other powerful questions that the film is raising about how can culture redeem mankind? To what extent can it do so? So again, it's a satire, and Kubrick is clearly talking about the idea of free will. Free will, and this is a very important notion that Kubrick comes back to, not only in The Clockwork Orange, but also in the next film as well. So with that, everyone, we turn now from Clockwork Orange, and we go to 1975 and Barry Lyndon, and we return now to the past. And if you would, everyone, if you go to page 34, I wanted to mention to you that after the success of 2001: A Space Odyssey, Kubrick wanted to make a film about Napoleon, and he had spent several years doing considerable research on Napoleon. But at the time, there was another film that had been made on that topic, and it came out, and it was not well received, either by critics or by audiences. So the producers who were going to, again, fund Kubrick's film on Napoleon withdrew. So therefore, he had to abandon that project and made A Clockwork Orange instead. And then with the commercial success of A Clockwork Orange, he was able then to turn to his next project, which turns out to be Barry Lyndon. And everyone, if you would please, and go to page 34, Barry Lyndon. It's 1975, a British-American drama, written, produced, and directed by Stanley Kubrick, and it's based on William Thackeray's The Luck of Barry Lyndon, republished as a novel, Memoirs of Barry Lyndon, a picaresque tale written and published in serial form in 1844. The film recounts the exploits of a fictional 18th century Irish adventurer. Exteriors were shot in Ireland, England, and Germany. And everyone, I'd like to now add a couple other thoughts, if I may, before we turn to this clip from Barry Lyndon. Another aspect of Kubrick's cinema that is very important to him, and that is the protracted scene or sequence, and that is that he allows for scenes and sequences to unfold for a very long period of time. Very deliberate, very calm, unheard, if you will, and in doing so, he wants the imagery to tell us the story, rather than relying too much on dialogue. This is not to suggest that there aren't many moments of memorable dialogue in his films. There are, but just as importantly, the idea of imagery and music. And he also is very attentive, if not extraordinarily sensitive, to the music that he uses. We saw that in Paths of Glory. We also heard this now in Clockwork Orange, and you're going to experience here as well. So the idea that he wants the music to complement the imagery in terms of telling the story. So in this particular scene that we're going to be looking at from Barry Lyndon, much of it is without dialogue, except for the opening, which we have a voiceover narration. The rest of the scene is completely silent, except for the music. And then at the very end, we have the voiceover narration as well. So with that, he uses the music of Mozart, of Bach, Vivaldi, Schubert, Irish folk music, and in this particular instance, he's using the music of Handel, the Sarabande from a suite in D minor. And he uses this piece several times throughout the film to underscore the idea of fate, the notion that Barry Lyndon does not have free choice, does not have control over his destiny, over his fate. And so the idea of hearing this music again and again and again is a constant reminder that in a sense he does not have the ability to be able to transcend, if you will, his destiny, his fate. There are also a couple other aspects I want to mention quickly, and then we'll turn to the clip, and that is the notion of the zoom shot. A zoom shot, as all of you know, is a camera that is moving towards the figure or the object or moving back through the focal lens, if you will, of the camera, as opposed to a dolly shot. And so there's one moment in this scene in which the camera is going to focus on a figure and then will pull out. And why does he do this? Kubrick does this a number of times throughout this film to underscore the relationship of these figures in this landscape in the 18th century. He wants as much as possible to create and recreate the feeling of what it must be like to have been living during the 18th century, a period of luxury, a privilege of class as it pertains to these characters. And so the movement is much more stately, it's much more deliberate. And so we see these figures against the landscape. And if we see figures against the landscape, we see them very much like a painting. And figures in paintings do not move. The same idea applies here, the notion that, again, that there are forces beyond man's control. Nature, institutions are much larger than any individual, most notably, in this case, Barry Lyndon. So I wanted to share that with you. And also one last point, if I may, with the voiceover narration, it's very interesting. If you look at the novella, it's told in the first person, according to Barry Lyndon. He's very much a raconteur, but he's also a very unreliable narrator. But Kubrick gives us an omniscient narrator. He doesn't have Barry tell his story, but rather he lets an omniscient narrator do so. Why? Because if Barry Lyndon does not have any control over the events in his life, what control does he have in the telling of the story itself? So in this respect, then, once again, Kubrick is asking us to maintain a detached, distant observation of human nature, in this case, Barry Lyndon. So with that, can we turn to the clip, please?
5 years in the army and some considerable experience of the world had by now dispelled any of those romantic notions regarding love with which Barry commenced life. And he began to have it in mind, as so many gentlemen had done before him, to marry a woman of fortune and condition. And as such things so often happen, these thoughts closely coincided with his setting first sight upon a lady who will henceforth play a considerable part in the drama of his life. The Countess of Linden, Viscountess Bullingdon of England, Baroness Castle Linden of the Kingdom of Ireland. A woman of vast wealth and great beauty. She was the wife of the Right Honourable Sir Charles Reginald Linden, Knight of the Bath, and Minister to George III at several of the smaller courts of Europe. A cripple wheeled about in a chair, worn out by gout and a myriad of diseases. Her ladyship's chaplain, Mr. Runt, acted in the capacity of tutor to her son, the little Viscount Bullingdon, a melancholy little boy, much attached to his mother. To make a long story short, 6 hours after they met, her ladyship was in love. And once Barry got into her company, he found innumerable occasions to improve his intimacy.
Thank you, Joe.
And was scarcely out.
Everyone, I'll talk about the importance of color in a moment. You can see here how beautifully and how attentively Kubrick is using imagery and music to convey the narrative, to tell the story. I also want to mention, too, that in preparing for Barry Lyndon, he studied the notable artists of the 18th century, and in a number of instances in the film, he actually recreates the paintings themselves on film. So, for example, he looked at the works of Thomas Gainsborough, John Constable, George Stubbs, Joshua Reynolds, and Henry Fuseli. So all of these works are very much apparent within the film itself. The film was nominated for 7 Oscars. It won 4, and it's no surprise that it won for cinematography, art direction, and costume design as well. And it's very interesting about Barry Lyndon at the time of its release. Although it was given a respectful consideration, it was not considered one of his best works. But now, again, as I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture, critics have reassessed the film, and now, in looking at it, now critics have said that it is Kubrick's forgotten masterpiece. So really, it has grown in stature over the years. And with that, everyone, what I'd like to do now, I'd like to turn to our next clip, and this is Full Metal Jacket. And if I may, everyone, if you go to, if you would please, 51, this is Full Metal Jacket, and this was made in 1987. And again, it was produced and directed by Kubrick, and the screenplay was by Kubrick, Michael Herr, and Gustav Hasford. Was based on Hasford's novel, The Short Timers. Its storyline follows a platoon of U.S. Marines through their training and the experiences of 2 of the platoon's Marines in the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War. The film's title refers to the full metal jacket bullet used by soldiers. Kubrick contacted Michael Herr, author of the Vietnam War memoirs Dispatches in 1977, in the spring of 1980 to discuss working on a film about the Holocaust, but he eventually discarded that in favor of a film about the Vietnam War. So with that, everyone, we're going to be looking at the opening of this film. And everyone, what's also interesting about Kubrick, and you'll see some of the familiar techniques that we've been watching tonight and I've been discussing in this clip as well, but he also takes a page from Rabelais as well, and that is that he's very fond of the scatological. So it's interesting in that in a number of films, some of the key moments, some of the pivotal moments take place in bathrooms. And there, it's very interesting because there we are at most vulnerable, or as Kubrick puts it, we are at our most ignoble, if you will. So we are naked in every sense of that word. And so it's very interesting that so often he places key moments, pivotal moments, in the bathroom. And you're going to see examples of the scatological humor in this opening as well. You'll also see, once again, the corridor shot that I've been talking about, the tracking shot, and you're also going to see a long take as well. What is a long take? A long take is simply a scene that has no cuts in it. So for the first part of the scene, it's very much a long take in which there's no interruption, and eventually then there will be a cut in the action. So with that, if we can, let us turn to the opening, and notice here it's called the hair montage. These are young men now who are going to be brought into the Marines, and they have their hair shaved. And notice how their individuality, so to speak, is being removed from them so they can function now as one unit. So, Joe, if we may. Thank you, Joe. Excuse me, Jack. Do we have time for one more short clip? All right, thank you. Everyone, you could see the grotesque at work here, do we not, right? We see, again, the comic and the horrific juxtaposed in the language and the treatment of the drill sergeant towards the recruits. Everyone, I'd like you to focus on that last character, Gomer Pyle, if you will, the Vincent D'Onofrio character, whom Hartman, the drill sergeant, will continually brutalize in this opening sequence. And I just want to show you one final short clip, if I may. And this is something that we often see in Kubrick's films as well, in terms of what happens to a character when he descends into fear or paranoia, or when his humanity has been stripped away from him. And so often what happens is, visually, we see the character lower his head, and then we see the eyelids looking up at the camera. We saw this in the opening shot of Alex in A Clockwork Orange. You're also going to see this in the character of Pyle as well, in Pyle's Major Malfunction. That's the chapter heading. And we see that as a result of this systematic brutalization on the part of the sergeant towards him, that his humanity has completely been destroyed, if you will. And he's been turned into a war machine, into an instrument of war in this regard. And there's a very telling question at one point in which he engages Pyle, in which the drill sergeant asks him, what is your major malfunction? Now, isn't that an interestingly phrased question? What is your major malfunction? When we think of malfunction, we think of its application to a machine, do we not? To technology. But he's directing it to a person. So the idea that the individual now has become the machine, and we see the consequences of that. So this is a very brief clip. So Joe, if we may. Okay. Before that, if we can run the before that. Just a few more. That's good. That's right there. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. It's a powerful, harrowing moment, and will become all the more so because shortly afterwards he will take his own life as well. So you can see the brutalization of the individual here, the man having become machine. Also a key moment taking place where? In the most vulnerable places in the bathroom as well. So again, all of these ideas that we've been talking about come to fruition in this particular moment, in this scene. So everyone, with that, it's already 7:15 and it's gone by much too quickly. I want to thank you for your time and your consideration and your interest in learning about Kubrick and seeing the film clips. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.